Great. Before I turn it over to Anne, I just want to give you guys a little bit of background on how Coffee Conversation Books came to be. So this is a program we share between all of the libraries in Dufferin County, so that's Shelburne, Orangeville, and Grand Valley. And our original concept saw us meet in these cozy cafes in our communities, but as we know, that's not possible right now. So we hope you've made your beverage of choice to meet us here for this virtual rendition. Through this program, we've had the opportunity to work with lots of really great local authors and bring the stories of our communities to light. Tonight, we're thrilled to bring Anne Burke here, who's the author of The Seventh Shot. And Anne's had a really interesting career path, which has taken her from the Royal Canadian Navy to a freelancer for newspapers like Sudbury and the Toronto Stars, and all the way to publishing The Seventh Shot, like I just said. Personally, I'm a pretty big lover of true crime, and I was astounded to find out that there were a series of murders in our own backyard, and I knew nothing about it. The bigger surprise of which is the identity, but I know some of you already know who that is, but I'm going to let Anne tell that story. And just like Shannon said, if you guys have questions, throw those in the chat box. We're monitoring it. And for now, I'm going to pass it over to Anne. So it's off to you.
Okay, thank you. So I guess next to the first slide. So on the left, where it all began. So on the left, this is my 1966 CDDHS yearbook picture showing the grade 12 class. Shelburne High School in the 60s was considerably smaller than now, with less than 350 students back then. One could basically identify any newcomers within a given school year. Ronald Glenn West, who would become widely known as the 22 caliber killer, is in the back row, third from the right, smiling quite uncharacteristically. I'm in the front row, third from the left. Possibly the most interesting thing I can tell you about this picture is how few of those in the class could recall West when I talked to them so many years later. In fact, most notable was his inconspicuousness. He found it hard to make eye contact, especially with young women. This would be expressed by so many, so often in the future, as would be how he somehow managed to remain invisible. It would be only a couple of years after this picture that we would eventually discover that West would begin to act on the terrible urges he harbored. So on the right-hand side, you'll see West almost immediately after leaving grade 12, which West was repeating the year of the class photo on the left. West would sign up as a cadet in the Metro Toronto Police Force. In retrospect now, it is somewhat surprising, as it later became quite apparent, that he had already been quite actively engaged in a number of criminal activities by then. He would be described during that time as a cadet as a quiet loner who chose not to join the other cadets and officers for a beer or get together in off hours. He was not known to date or speak of a girlfriend. One officer would befriend him during that period, and what he was to so carefully record would assist in filling out the picture of West as the 22 caliber killer some 30 years later. Next. So the crimes on the left. During the course of researching and writing The Seventh Shot, I sorted through masses of archived photos, including many that were very grim. But this photo will haunt me forever. On May 6, 1970, a stranger came to the home of Albert and 34-year-old Doreen Morby. Their Aprey home was set back somewhat on a side road in Gormley, Ontario. Albert, a teacher, was at school that day, and Doreen, a nurse, was home attending to her 22-month-old son, Brent. After gaining access to the home, under some pretense, possibly while brandishing a weapon or even identifying as a police officer, the stranger would rape and shoot Doreen a total of 7 times in the back and head. Between shots, Doreen, partially paralyzed, was able to crawl forward, clasping her son to her before succumbing to her wounds. Little Brent would stay safely pinned in his dead mother's arms until Albert returned home. The little slipper, you can see, lay in a pool of Brent's mother's blood, where it would be later photographed by the police. On the right, on May 19th, the 37-year-old Helen Ferguson you see here, also a nurse, also married to a teacher, Russell, would become the second victim of the .22 caliber killer. Helen and her family lived in Palgrave, which was considerably more rural at that time. She was also staying home to concentrate on rearing her 3 children. Normally, on such a school day, after lunch, when the youngest left for kindergarten, she would be alone. Not on this day. Her oldest, Dale, aged 8, was home recovering from the mumps and set up in a downstairs bedroom with a television. A stranger would again enter a home through devious means, raping and then shooting Helen 3 times with a .22 caliber weapon. Dale would become aware that this wasn't an innocent visitor from a stranger looking for help as the man fled the home. A remarkably astute young man, he was able to provide pretty accurate details to a sketch artist later. Again, a husband would return home to find his wife and mother of his children dead at the hands of a stranger. Next slide. Beginning the search. On the left, here's a very young York Regional Police Officer, the late Don Hillock, sits at his desk in the then newly formed York Regional Police Headquarters on the future Don Hillock Drive in Aurora, Ontario. Earlier in the year, prior to the establishing of the York Regional Police, Don had served with the Whitchurch Police and had been the first officer on the scene at the Morby murder site. I would hear in much detail many years later, initially at Don and Joan Hillock's kitchen table in Orangeville, about the lifelong obsession that more than one officer shared to identify the .22 caliber killer, and right up to how Hillock would later attend the trial of that very individual. On the right, see Don. Don would climb to the rank of York Regional Police Chief, where he admitted continuing to obsess about the 1970 killings. He would be one of 2 pivotal police officers to ask themselves, in relation to the Morby case, who shoots someone 6 times at close range and stops to reload and shoot a 7th? I came to consider Don Hillock a friend and found him a truly lovely human being. Next. Finalizing the search. On the left, this is young OPP officer Donald J. McNeil, next to his cruiser at the Brechin OPP detachment on Lake Simcoe in the mid-1960s. McNeil would enlist under OPP Commissioner Eric Silk, under Silk's updated entry requirements that loosened up in regards to girth and height restrictions at the time, Don being a little shorter in stature than once permitted. He would attend the second murder site, that of Helen, in the 70s, and store away particular details of the case, which would ultimately help him to identify the killer some 30 years hence. Don McNeil would head up a number of notable cases over the years, which I also document in The Seventh Shot. He would be considered largely responsible for the solving of the 2 murders. On the right, here again, by now Detective Inspector Donald J. McNeil on the right in the picture is shown here near his retirement, next to then OPP Commissioner Tom O'Grady. Don would, with a lot of talent and some magic, peg Ronald Glenn West for the 2 crimes before his retirement. We stay in touch today. I've missed dropping in to see him since the onset of the pandemic, as well as I've missed his very dark humor and his great appreciation for my homemade blueberry muffins that I always take. Next. Putting a face to the crime. So on the left here, 8-year-old Dale Ferguson, Helen Ferguson's son, was to assist Metro Toronto sketch artist Joseph Majuri with putting together this surprisingly good likeness of his mother's killer, as well as giving his fairly detailed description of the intruder whom he saw only briefly. Along with Majuri, many of those involved in the investigation one way or another would remark on Dale's maturity and presence of mind under the most horrific of circumstances. And then to the right, the poster with a sketch and a description of a possible vehicle used by the perpetrator. A poster was developed. I discovered among news releases later suggestions that West had been among the actual police officers to circulate these posters. But in researching the crimes, I found nothing to suggest that this was the case. This poster would actually focus attention on an individual who in reality looked far more like the poster image than the actual perpetrator did, and owned a similar vehicle to boot, introducing a red herring into the case. Regardless, After about 10 years of steady investigation, the cases would both become cold. Next. Murder Park. On the left there, a really idyllic scene. Jumping forward about 20 years, there's a particularly beautiful little pullover site on the Trans-Canada Highway about 16 kilometers west of Blind River. Since a horrific pair of murders there in 1991, it has generally been referred to, sadly, as Murder Park. On a late June day in 1991, a senior couple, Gord and Jackie McAllister, were driving west in their Winnebago. Signs both in and at the entrance to the park stated that overnight parking was prohibited, but it was getting late and they could not see the harm of staying. They were alone and well out of sight of the highway. During the night, a man identifying himself as a police officer knocked on the door and, heavily armed, pushed his way in after telling them they were prohibited from staying overnight. In the course of ordering Jackie to empty her purse, the intruder suddenly shot her in the chest. Gord made a dive for the doorway and hid beneath the Winnebago. At that moment, a young local man, Brian Major, arrived on site, possibly to either use the facilities or finish the burger he had on the front seat next to him. He got out of the car and, realizing that something was terribly wrong, got back into the driver's seat. The armed intruder approached the car and shot Brian directly in the face through the windshield. The shooter then fled, leaving Brian and Jackie dead, and McAllister ultimately able to flee the highway for help. The case would remain cold with no probable suspects for years. On the right there, OPP Detective Sergeant Ed Pellerin of the Blind River Detachment spent his entire career in Blind River. In the mid-1990s, he would arrest Ronald Glenn West, who had moved to Blind River in the late 80s. Arrested for a series of vicious robberies against seniors and women in the Sudbury to Sault Ste. Marie corridor. In 1995, West was tried and convicted and sentenced for the robberies for up to 8 years. The robberies and later revelations made by West would alert Pellerin to wonder if West might be responsible for the earlier Murder Park robberies also. Next. The revealing. While West was serving time for the North Shore robberies, a series of events would lead to West becoming a suspect for the two now very cold 1970 murders. And I don't want to give away the whole story here. The now
I was speaking with someone earlier, and they actually, their husband was a neighbor of Ron West, and their brother went to school with Anne. So I'm just wondering if any of those who are with us this evening, if any of you have a personal connection to maybe Anne or to Ron West as well, or just to the area.
It looks like Matt has his hand up. You're welcome to unmute yourself, Matt, if you'd like to speak to that.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I'm Matt's wife, Kelly, and I was just about to pop in here and just, you asked if anybody knows Anne personally, and it turns out I know her. Yeah, so I think I could say a little bit about how much time Anne has spent researching this book and the passion that she put into writing it.
Oh, sure.
I think she spent about 5 years researching and literally having mountains of boxes delivered to her house from the OPP, filled with just documents, photographs. It's basically like a dream come true for what do they call all the people on the web sleuths for web sleuths. You know, it's just like she just ended up like buried in tons and tons of information. And she sifted through all of this stuff for years to pull this book together. And yeah, it's as, you know, I know she left us on a cliffhanger, but it is as creepy as it sounds. He's a really dark and really scary man, and his murders are atrocious, and I don't know how to say it. Like he basically terrorized a small town. So hopefully when she gets back on, she can tell us in great detail about how the town was terrorized, because she's got a lot of information on that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Jennifer, I see that your hand is raised. Sorry about that. Feel free to unmute.
Hi, this is Jennifer. I'm actually Anne's daughter. I know you guys are on the phone with her trying to reconnect, but I have a few things I could mention. I worked a few years back with Don Hillock after he met my mom and was working. He had decided that it would be perhaps a good time for him to record his own memoirs. So I spent the next few years working with him and kind of having a collection of his whole career and the important cases he worked on. And it was just interesting from that perspective, being able to see how he carried it with him for the rest of his life, and how important it was that he was there during part of the trial, and just how it isn't something when you move on that you ever necessarily overcome, that it was always of interest. And my mom had the hardest time tracking him down to speak to him, and they kind of brushed her off. And then next she heard he'd reached out to say, yes, I want to speak about it. So it was really interesting. He wanted definitely to give his recollection of the event, even though it had been many years since, but he very much had a vivid memory that day. And it was through part of his ingenuity of collecting the evidence that really did make this case all those years later still be able to test for evidence, that the system wasn't really in place to um, to use the evidence back then, but all these years later, they were able to use that evidence that had been collected at that murder scene.
It's remarkable. I was thinking of your mom too, and just as Kelly was saying, you know, she had all of this information and all of this research, and how that must have impacted her as well, right? Because she was so invested in the story, and then learned all of these people so intimately, and how their families were impacted, how the officers were impacted, and I just wonder how it must have had an impact on her, and how she found a way to sort of shut that off, and not let it affect her too much.
I think her work, she used to counsel abused women and children. And I think a lot of that training she had kicked in. I know it's not something I could do. I've read the first half of the book and couldn't read anymore. Just some of the details as a mother are horrific. To read. I know what happens, but I just can't at this point. I'm not one of those true crime ladies that are out there. But I think she's just incredibly strong-willed, and she's able to hope that maybe this is some closure for the people that worked on it and for the people whose lives were directly impacted by it. She's always been very good at analyzing and interpreting data. So.
Wow. Yeah, to have the closure, like you were saying, come from all of that work and her efforts would make, it makes all the difference.
Yeah, and just it's like all of the experiences she had in the past by working in journalism and working with abused women and children, and working with children through the community center. And in the book, she goes into a story that happened in not in Hornings Mills, pardon me, in, I forget the name of the place, Honeywood. And she recollects the story of her working there that day, and somebody coming in to let her know that there were what they thought was a child screaming. So she went to investigate because she'd been trained in CPR, and she stumbled across a man trying to murder a woman. My mom got a hold of her and carried her across the street and provided life-saving first aid to her. She doesn't talk about this, but she was awarded an OPP citation of bravery
Wow.
for that action. And the interesting thing was he was a former Toronto police officer. So that story comes up again of power in the wrong hands. And he knew while trying to injure her, and essentially he had tried to strangle her and he had slit her wrists, but he knew to slit down the length of her arm because it would cause more damage, essentially. So just somebody who's witnessed this. I think I was 12 at the time, and I remember coming home from school and my mom had different clothes on, and there were police, like all kinds of stuff happening, and my parents had to tell us what had happened. But my mom kind of went into that mode of, okay, we've got to deal with this and move on to this. So I think all of those things in her background led her to be able to write something and with compassion for the victims.
Right. Wow. So it looks like we have a few people just sharing in the comments about their personal connections. Janice has shared Ron was in grade 9 at the same time that I was also in grades 10, 11, 12, different homerooms, but that you knew him. And looking back, Janice, I mean, I guess, is hindsight 2020? Did you get any sort of feelings from him at the time, or? And then Carol has also shared she went to school at Horning Mills and then Center Dufferin District High School in Shelburne, and we're in the same grades in high school with West. And Janice has shared that she thought he was kind of sleazy.
So the top left, the revealing. So while West was serving time for the North Shore robberies, a series of events would lead to West becoming suspect for the two by now very cold 1970 murders. And I don't want to give away the whole story here. The now Detective Inspector Don McNeil would head up the task force. During the investigation of West for the Morby Ferguson murders, a former Metro Toronto police officer by the name of Keith Rogers was able to provide some very incriminating evidence that involved timelines and even photographs. Because West and Rogers were at the same shift in Metro during 1970, Keith could provide exact dates that they were both off duty. Then on the right, this photo, most notably from the cover of the book, shows West at his family's farm in Amaran, where during 1970, he and Rogers attended a couple of times to carry out some target practice. A number of weapons can be seen, but one in particular was to catch the investigating officer's attention over the others. And then the next slide.
You're good.
Okay, a 32-year wait. On the left, Max Haynes, the renowned longtime Canadian true crime reporter and author, would cover both Don McNeil and the 70s cold case for many years. Haynes and McNeil would develop a long-term friendship. In fact, when the case finally broke, McNeil would call Haynes to report that Max had got him. Max would also attend the trial that followed. And on the right there, at the end of the 1970 murders, West owned a number of weapons, including a .38 caliber six-shot revolver, but most notably an Astra Cadiz 9-shot 22. West actually sold the 9-shot in 1972, we know now, but he kept the incriminating sheet of paper, perhaps a grim souvenir in his twisted mind, that tied him to the gun. Production of the Astra Cadiz 22s ended in 1974, so it would become a relatively rare piece. In another of many strange coincidences throughout the book, it turned out that an acquaintance of one of the investigative team's officers had purchased the one and same 9-shot revolver years before. And so next to our final page.
You're there.
Okay. In closing, I want to mention that I've only touched on the entire story. I know it seems like a lot, but there's a lot to this story, and most particularly absent is the core reason as to why it was so important to me to document this case in its entirety. I've heard from many readers since the book released who shared their personal links. It's been very interesting, and I continue to do so. If anybody wants to get in touch with me at a later date, you can through my website or on Facebook. You can message me. I'd be very happy to respond. And I hope I piqued your interest. I really want to remind you too now, it's important. The 7 Shot is readily available at your local library. And thank you. I'm sorry about this glitch. I really still don't know what's happened. But anyway, I'm here chatting, and I'll pass back to you ladies.
Thanks, Anne. That's great. And thanks also for being flexible yourself. I think you're absolutely right to end on the note that a lot of people are well connected to this story through one way or another. And if anybody has any questions, now is a good time to either put those in the chat, or like Shannon said, you guys can just raise your hands, which I saw you guys all doing. Well, you guys think about your burning questions, and maybe I'll start off if you're okay with that. So the 7 Shot is, it reads a lot like fiction, but it's not, which is the surprising part. I love the way you write. And, unlike authors who have to kind of imagine these characters and come up with a story, you actually had to talk to a lot of people, including family members of victims and police officers and that sort of thing. Could you speak a bit to the experience you had, like how you had to approach those different groups of people? Like, did you have to take a different tactic for the families or police officers, or am I off base there?
No, not at all. No, actually, as far as speaking very directly to immediate family members of those that passed, I've talked to family members since the book came out, a little more distant than immediate, but it was generally people who knew West, or it was the police investigating, or people that knew him through the mines, or when he was in Blind River, or on the police force. And generally, everybody's been very forthcoming. It's never been difficult. Some people would even apologize that they maybe couldn't offer enough information. And no, it was very seamless. And I had people who would call me up that I hadn't actually arranged to speak with, offering information and so on. And it was all very positive. I think there was one incident where someone had suggested I speak to some of West's actual family members, and I left it as to whether they wished to or not, and they didn't at that time, and I quite understood, because I consider them also to be victims in his case. But no, it was a surprisingly good experience.
Wow, that's really powerful. Janice, I see you've got your hand up there. If you're comfortable unmuting, go ahead.
Hi, Anne. Hello, Anne.
Yeah.
This is Janice Arnold. Hi. I was concerned about the 2 boys, and what kind of a childhood that they had, and that how they would turn out.
Well, interesting. I know that second, I know from a relative who got in touch with me after the book came out. He lives out in BC, but he got in touch with me and told me that Brent was doing all right as far as they were concerned. I think he was particularly young compared to Dale, and Dale's sister and brother, Stephen and Pam, they were the other 2. They, the Ferguson children, had a very difficult time, particularly so because there was that fear in not knowing who the perpetrator was, and that Dale had, come up with a pretty good description and sketch of him, that he would be targeted. So the family moved a lot, and Dale was sent off to live with an aunt, and those children I know went under years and years and years of psychotherapy to deal with this. It was pretty awful.
I was wondering about the two kids of Ron West, Joe and Gavin.
All right.
That must have been a terrible upbringing for them, you know, a terrible life.
Yes. Well, I did ask Detective Sergeant Ed Pellerin at Blind River. He kind of kept an eye out for them, and as far as anybody knows, they've gone on with their lives. They went into foster care after their dad went into jail, and the first time back in '95, and they seem to have lived pretty good and productive lives. They reconnected with their birth mother, who they had believed for years had discarded them, or then later believed she was dead, and all kinds of stories they were told. But I believe they have done very well. I purposely did not try to follow up with them. I knew if they wanted to say anything, they knew how to reach me. They could have through the OPP sergeant in Blind River, and I left it that way. They certainly earned their privacy, and
Yeah.
you know,
I think that perhaps Rena LaCroix was maybe a very positive influence on them, just for the brief time that she was their mother.
Yes, she tried very hard. She was very
Poor lady.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Enjoyed your book, sort of.
Thanks, Jan. That was a great comment and question. Does anybody else have any burning questions for Anne?
I think I recognized some of the names of people before I was so rudely cut off here. But I think I recognize the names there that I recall. I don't know if they're still online, but maybe from Honeywood.
It looks like a few locals there for sure.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I have another question, Anne, if you're open to it.
Yes.
One thing the audience members of Coffee Conversation Books very often like to know is the workflow of an author. We've had some authors share with us they work literally sticky notes as ideas come to them, or some people are very rigid in their day. So if you speak a bit to that would be great.
Okay. Well, it's funny, I did think about that recently, and I remember years and years ago, and this was not writing a book, but just, thinking about what it would be like to write a book and how one goes about, setting up that kind of discipline. And I read about a fellow by the name of Mickey Spillane. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember who he was. He wrote the Mike Hammer detective stories years and years ago, and I had read that he lived in New England, I believe, and he had this little cabin down on the rocks by the sea, and he would go down there every morning at first light, and all he had was a typewriter and a desk and his paper and a bottle of whiskey. And he would work there till about 2 o'clock, and that was it. And every day, 7 days a week, he did that. And I thought that was quite amazing, although I don't think I would have gotten much done with a bottle of whiskey there with me. But anyway, I always thought that would be so neat to be able to remove yourself completely from everything and go off somewhere. And I've always thought that would be great. As it is, I am fairly remote. My little office is kind of facing into the woods, and there's nothing other than wild animals out there to distract me. And I try to set up a day just like a work day, where I start and get ready for work, just as if I was going off to work, get ready for work, and then I carry on. That's my plan, but it's morphed a lot. I now find if I'm on a roll, I'll just work on through, and I'll look up, and it's 4 hours from when I last looked up. Right. And if I'm feeling like it, I'll get up in the middle of the night or early in the morning and start working away when it's quiet and that. And it's funny because I know for a fact that when I'm sitting there working away, emails will come through from other writers. So I know they do the same thing. But I really require very little, just a bit of quiet, some classical music, and a cup of tea maybe, and I'm happy, quite happy.
That sounds nice. A good workflow there. Maybe we'll give it maybe a minute if anybody's got a question they really want to ask Anne about her writing or even her experiences publishing. I know you guys talked about it a lot while we were doing a little tech troubleshooting there, so I missed a little bit of that, but it sounded great what I could hear.
I'll mention one thing about publishing since you brought it up. It's kind of interesting, and this is new to, the world of publishing is very new to most people when you do write a book. So many people now are self-publishing and that. But when I originally wrote the book, like my son was very much a part of encouraging me, editing, and helping me with the book. He's got a real head for this. And he all along throughout the book insisted, you really should put yourself in that story because it's important to you. And I never wanted to. I didn't have the story. I overheard you talking about the Honeywood incident and so on. But I never wanted to. I didn't feel like I belonged in the story. But it's so funny. So I finished up my manuscript, and when it came to that publisher who was particularly interested, Latitude 46, they said to me, we really like your book, but we don't understand why you haven't included yourself in the book, knowing. So needless to say, that involved a rewrite, and that is why I came to become a part of the book, and I start entering the book. I think it's about the middle where I jumped to the Honeywood incident and that. But it was an interesting experience, but it's a learning experience too, because it's hard to put yourself in the reader's position, and I often think about the reader who's reading this that I know would know West, or would know me, or would know or whomever. So yeah.
That's interesting. I see we've got a question there. Bev and Harold, if you're comfortable unmuting, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Harold. I don't believe they ever convicted him of the Blind River murders. Do you think they ever will, or?
You know what? I put out a little plea once in a while. They've never closed it. It's still a cold case. I think I mentioned in the book that I've wondered even if it would be worthwhile going to West, he seems quite happy to remain in jail as far as we can tell at this point in his life. And I just wondered if there wouldn't be some point in going to him and seeing if he would confess to it at this point. You could stay in jail, and if you're happy and so on, and we won't take away whatever freedoms you've earned, because he's in pretty light to medium security. He might even get day passes for all I know now. But, no, it's cold. But I still say somebody might find something, an old gun that's been thrown in the river, in the silt, or they might find some jewelry that's been buried. Who knows? So it's still possible. They had what they thought was a little bit of evidence, and they took it to the Crown Attorney in the Sioux, and they said no, it wasn't really enough. But I mean, they would jump on anything any day, I know, if they thought that they could tie it and give that family, I mean, some rest, especially the young fellow there, his Brian Major, his mom and dad are still alive, and it must be awful. He was a young father, and never to know what happened to him must be very hard.
Thank you.
Carol?
Anybody have any final questions for Anne?
Jade, we just have a comment in the chat from Sharon, and she's asked, how long did it take to go from your initial submission to the publisher until it was printed? And then what other book launches or promotions are you doing?
Okay. I had a publisher that I wanted to go to, which is a silly idea. I know that now. But it was someone that it was actually one of the people that did the review, Professor Lee Miller. He had been published by a particular publisher, and I thought, gee, I'd like them to publish my book. And it was funny because I sent my book to them, and they held it for almost a year, saying, you know, we're interested, we just need another person to look, and this and it was almost a year, and they said, well, no, we're coming out with another similar sort of book right now, and that was that. So I then approached Latitude 46 because of the northern aspect too of the story. That's largely where the interest lies, and it was a big part of the story. And so I went to them. They, as I said, I did a rewrite of the book in a pretty quick turnover time. I think about 2 months, with my son's help with editing and that bringing up to date. Then when that was done, you had to go through the proofreading and the proper editing and so on. Then there's 2 times a year that a particular publisher will come out with books, in the spring and in the fall. So I missed the spring by then, even though I'd been accepted the spring before. So then it was the fall by then of last year. So they had the manuscript in one form or another for over a year by then. It's not something that happens quickly at all. As much as I always anticipated, oh, we're on the way, you know, but no. But there's so many little things, even when you get down to the wire, fiddling about, you know, are the pictures crisp enough for old pictures and placement and so many things to take into account. It gives you a real appreciation of publishing, I know, and, which has been particularly difficult in these times as well, publishing as well as sharing books. As for upcoming events, everything I've been doing has been pretty much virtual at this point. Right now, today, I'm a member of the Crime Writers of Canada, and right now and today, I'm long listed for the Crime Writers of Canada's non-fiction 2021 book, and I'm long listed. Today, some point tonight, they're going to announce the 5 that make it on to be shortlisted, and I haven't heard anything on that yet, and I don't even presume to think I will have a chance, but anyway, that's always an exciting thing when your book's put forward by your publisher and so on. They have the confidence to, you know, to see who enjoys it. So, and I've had some great reviews from different areas, so no, it's been quite exciting.
It's exciting. We'll have to watch for the short list to be released.
Well, yeah, no, keep my fingers crossed, but yeah.
There'll be lots of us with our fingers crossed for you, Anne.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I think my husband might be in the next room listening, although he was all caught up in me getting disconnected and everything and trying to get but no. He might have loved me.
It looks like we just have another comment coming through.
Okay.
Sharon has shared, thanks very much. Enjoyed your presentation and looking forward to reading your book.
Oh, terrific. That's great. Thank you. Like I said, they'll have it at the library.
Does anybody have any final questions? Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it there. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Anne, for your presentation. We all did our best to kind of troubleshoot there, and I think we definitely came through that on the other side. I know this is really special for a lot of people who joined, because they do have a connection to you or the case, or one way or the other, and your warm self and the way you write the book really deepens that connection. I think, at least that's my experience. So thanks again to everyone who came out to Coffee Conversation and Books. And I just want to remind you that our next event is going to be held on July 21st and will feature author Valerie Mathers. So keep your eyes open for those details. So thanks, guys. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.